Little Eagle turned his luminous gaze toward the elderly medicine woman, and Running Bear saw recognition pass between them. An acknowledgment of shared purpose that transcended the normal boundaries between generations and states of existence. "They speak of a choice that must be made," Little Eagle replied, his words carrying the weight of prophecy and the burden of cosmic responsibility. "The Apache people stand at the edge of a great divide. One path leads to gradual extinction as their culture dissolves under pressure from the white world, their children growing up without knowledge of the old ways, their connection to the sacred lands severed forever. The other path requires sacrifice beyond anything our people have previously endured, but offers the possibility of survival as Apache rather than as shadows of their former selves." The boy gestured toward a section of the tree's massive trunk, where the bark seemed thinner, more translucent than the surrounding wood. As Running Bear watched in fascination, that area began to glow with soft light that revealed an opening, a doorway that appeared to lead into depths far greater than the tree's physical dimensions could possibly contain. "This passage connects to the realm where spirits dwell," Little Eagle explained, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a simple physical reality. "Through it, the living can journey to the place where the ancestors wait, where knowledge and power exist without the limitations imposed by physical existence. But such journeys come with a price that few would willingly pay." Running Bear stared at the supernatural doorway with emotions that ranged from terror to desperate longing. The possibility of joining his son in whatever realm existed beyond death held enormous appeal for someone whose life had been defined by loss and forced separation from everything he held dear. Yet the warrior's instincts that had kept him alive through decades of conflict warned that such choices inevitably carried consequences that extended far beyond individual desire. "What price?" he asked, though part of him already understood what Little Eagle's answer would reveal. "To pass through this doorway means abandoning physical existence forever," the boy replied, his translucent features growing even more solemn. "But in return, the traveler gains the ability to guide and protect the Apache people from the spirit realm, to influence events in ways that living humans cannot achieve. The ancestors have shown me visions of what such protection could accomplish, how supernatural intervention might preserve Apache culture through the dark years that lie ahead." The implications of this revelation struck Running Bear like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. Little Eagle was offering him the ultimate reunion, the chance to be with his beloved son for eternity. But that reunion required complete sacrifice of his earthly existence, transformation from living father to spirit. In the harsh wilderness of the Arizona Territory, a father's love would defy death itself. Running Bear, a respected Apache warrior, had lost everything that mattered to him when his 7-year-old son Little Eagle was taken by fever during the brutal winter of 18. In his grief, he planted a single cottonwood sapling at the boy's grave, whispering ancient prayers into the desert wind. What happened next defied all understanding of nature. The tree grew at an impossible rate, reaching heights that should have taken decades in just a few short years. Its roots spread deep and wide, creating shade where none should exist in the unforgiving desert. The other Apache began to whisper that the tree held the spirit of Little Eagle, watching over them with supernatural power. 10 years later, when the tribe returned to their sacred burial ground, they discovered something that would shake their understanding of life and death forever. But what they found beneath that magnificent tree would either save their people or destroy everything they believed in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the autumn sun of 1885, its red earth baked hard as pottery beneath the hooves of Running Bear's painted horse. He was a man shaped by this land, carved from the same stone, and blessed with the same endurance. At 32 winters, he carried himself with the quiet authority of one who had earned his place among the warriors through deed rather than boast. His hands, scarred from countless battles with both nature and man, held the reins with practiced ease as he guided his mount along the familiar path toward home. The war lance strapped to his back had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. 3 generations of Apache warriors had carried this weapon into battle, each adding their own marks to its wooden shaft, each leaving their spirit within its carved symbols. Running Bear touched the lance's binding with reverence, feeling the weight of his ancestors' expectation. Soon he would pass it to his own son, Little Eagle, when the boy reached the age of manhood. The thought brought a smile to his weathered face. Little Eagle, 7 winters old and already showing the keen intelligence that marked the finest hunter. The boy possessed an uncanny ability to read the land, to sense the movement of animals through vibrations in the earth that others missed entirely. Just yesterday, he had tracked a wounded deer for 3 miles, following signs so subtle that even Moon Shadow, the tribe's wisest elder, had marveled at his skill. "Your son sees with more than his eyes," she had told Running Bear, her ancient voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "The spirits speak to him in ways they speak to few. Guard him well, for such gifts often come with great purpose." Moon Shadow's words echoed in Running Bear's mind as he crested the low hill that overlooked their camp. Below, the familiar collection of wickiups dotted the valley floor like desert flowers blooming after rain. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could see the small figures of children playing between the dwellings. His heart quickened as he spotted Little Eagle among them, the boy's distinctive copper-colored headband catching the afternoon light. The Apache way of life flowed around him like a river, finding its natural course. Women tended fires and prepared meals, their voices rising in gentle conversation. Men worked with tools and weapons, passing knowledge to eager young apprentices. Elders sat in the shade, their stories weaving the fabric of tribal memory. This was more than survival. This was the continuation of a people who had called this harsh land home for countless generations. Chief Standing Wolf emerged from the largest wickiup, his presence commanding immediate respect. Though past his 60th year, the chief moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man. His eyes, dark as obsidian, held the accumulated wisdom of decades spent leading his people through times of plenty and seasons of hardship. A thick scar across his left cheek spoke of battles fought in defense of Apache freedom, while the eagle feathers in his gray hair marked achievements in war and peace alike. "You return with good news, I hope," Standing Wolf said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership, tempered by genuine concern for his people. Running Bear dismounted and walked his horse toward the chief, his expression growing serious. The scouting mission had taken him deep into territories where white settlers pushed ever westward, their wagons leaving scars across land that had known only the gentle passage of Apache feet for centuries untold. What he had seen troubled him deeply. "More soldiers at the fort," he reported, keeping his voice low so the children would not overhear. "They speak of new orders from the territorial government, treaties that would move all Apache to reservation lands far from here." The words hung between them like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Both men understood what such treaties meant. They had seen other tribes forced from ancestral lands, their children forbidden to speak native tongues, their sacred practices outlawed by men who understood nothing of Apache way. The very thought of leaving this valley, where their ancestors' bones rested in honored graves, where every stream and hill held meaning passed down through generations of storytelling, seemed an impossibility too terrible to contemplate. Yet the alternative might prove even worse. Resistance would bring the full might of the territorial army down upon their people, and Running Bear had seen enough of white man's warfare to know that Apache courage, however fierce, could not stand forever against such overwhelming numbers and superior weapons. "We will speak of this after the evening meal," Standing Wolf decided, his tone indicating the conversation was ended for now. Let the people enjoy these last hours of peace. The winter that descended upon the Apache encampment 3 moons later brought with it a cold unlike any the elders could remember. The wind howled through the valley with the voice of angry spirits, driving snow horizontally across the desert floor and piling it against the wickiups in great white drifts that seemed to grow taller with each passing hour. What had begun as an early winter storm had transformed into something far more sinister, a relentless assault that trapped the tribe in their shelters and slowly consumed their carefully hoarded supplies. Moon Shadow moved through the camp like a spirit herself, her ancient frame bundled in layers of hide and fur that made her appear twice her actual size. At 73 winters, she was the keeper of the tribe's healing knowledge, the one who knew which plants could break a fever and which ceremonies could call back a wandering soul. Her healing bundle, a sacred collection of herbs and spiritual objects, passed down through generations of medicine women, accompanied her on every visit to the sick. Inside the bundle lay the accumulated wisdom of her people. Sweet grass for purification ceremonies, sage for cleansing negative spirits, and dozens of carefully preserved roots and leaves, each with its own purpose in the ancient art of healing. But for all her knowledge, for all the power contained within those sacred items, Moon Shadow found herself facing an enemy that seemed to laugh at her efforts. The sickness had begun with the children, as these things often did. A fever that burned like fire in their small bodies, accompanied by a cough that sounded like the cry of dying ravens. One by one, the youngest members of the tribe succumbed to the illness, their parents helpless to do anything but hold them close and pray to the spirits for mercy that did not come. Little Eagle had been among the last to fall ill, his natural strength and vitality providing some protection against the disease that swept through the camp like wildfire. For 3 days, Running Bear had watched his son battle the fever, the boy's small body alternately burning with heat and shaking with chills that no amount of buffalo robes could warm. Moon Shadow had tried everything in her considerable arsenal of remedies, brewing teas from precious herbs, burning sage to cleanse the air, and chanting the healing songs that had been passed down from the time when the world was young. "The spirits are angry," she whispered to Running Bear, as they maintained their vigil beside Little Eagle's sleeping form. "This sickness comes from beyond our world, carried on winds that blow from places where the dead walk. It tests our faith, our connection to the sacred ways." Running Bear knelt beside his son's bed, watching the labored rise and fall of the boy's chest. Little Eagle's face, usually bright with curiosity and mischief, had taken on the pallor of old bone. His breathing came in short, painful gasps that tore at his father's heart with each struggle. The medicine pouch that Little Eagle always wore, filled with his own collection of sacred stones and feathers, lay against his thin chest, rising and falling with each precious breath. Outside the wickiup, the wind continued its mournful song, but inside, a different kind of battle raged. This was not the clean fight of warrior against warrior, where courage and skill could determine the outcome. This was a war against an invisible enemy that attacked the most vulnerable, that struck without warning and showed no mercy to the innocent. Other families throughout the camp fought similar battles. The sound of mourning songs had become a constant presence, mixing with the wind to create a symphony of loss that seemed to seep into the very bones of the survivors. Parents who had lost children moved through their daily tasks like sleepwalkers, their eyes holding the hollow look of those who had seen their most precious dreams turn to dust. Chief Standing Wolf, despite his own grief at the loss of his youngest grandson, continued to provide leadership and comfort to his people. He moved from dwelling to dwelling, offering what encouragement he could, reminding the survivors that the Apache had endured hardships before and would endure them again. But even his strong voice carried an undertone of uncertainty, for this enemy was unlike any they had faced in living memory. The tribal burial customs, sacred traditions that honored the dead and provided comfort to the living, were strained to their limits as the death toll mounted. The frozen ground made digging graves nearly impossible, forcing delays that added to the emotional burden of the survivors. Each funeral ceremony became a test of faith, a question of whether the spirits still watched over the Apache people or had turned their faces away in displeasure. Little Eagle drew his final breath as the first light of dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Running Bear felt his son's small hand grow still in his own, felt the life force that had burned so brightly for 7 short years flicker and fade like a candle guttering in the wind. The silence that followed seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the Wickiup, beyond the boundaries of the camp, reaching into the very heart of the desert itself. Moonshadow's weathered hands closed Little Eagle's eyes with infinite gentleness, her movements carrying the weight of ritual performed too many times in recent days. She began the morning chant in her thin, ancient voice, the words flowing like water over stones worn smooth by countless years. Other voices joined hers from throughout the camp, creating a harmony that spoke of shared grief and communal strength in the face of overwhelming loss. The Apache way demanded that the dead be honored with proper ceremony, their spirits guided to the place where ancestors waited with open arms. But the frozen ground and continuing storm made the traditional burial impossible. For 3 days, the body of Little Eagle lay wrapped in the finest robes the family possessed, while Running Bear and the other men took turns breaking the earth with tools that shattered against ground hard as iron. Chief Standing Wolf finally decreed that they would carry the boy to the sacred burial ground that lay in the sheltered valley 2 days' journey to the north. It was a place where generations of Apache had been laid to rest, where ancient stones marked graves so old that even the eldest could not remember the names of those who slept beneath them. The location held power that transcended the physical world, a connection to the spirit realm that made it the most appropriate resting place for one whose gifts had marked him as touched by the supernatural. The funeral procession moved through the storm-swept landscape like ghosts themselves, their figures bent against the driving wind as they carried Little Eagle toward his final rest. Running Bear walked beside the travois that bore his son's body, his hands gripping his war lance so tightly that his knuckles showed white beneath the skin. The weight of the weapon seemed to mock him now, for all his warrior's skill had proven useless against the enemy that had stolen his child. The sacred burial ground revealed itself gradually through the swirling snow, ancient stones emerging from the white landscape like the bones of sleeping giants. These weathered markers had stood sentinel over Apache dead for time beyond count, their surfaces carved with symbols that spoke of lives lived with honor, of warriors who had fallen in battle, of mothers who had died bringing new life into the world, of elders who had passed their wisdom to the next generation before walking the spirit trail to join their ancestors. Some of the stones were so old that wind and weather had worn their inscriptions to barely visible traces, but their presence still commanded respect. They represented the continuity of Apache existence, the unbroken chain that connected the living to those who had gone before. To be buried here was to become part of something larger than individual existence, to join the collective spirit that watched over the tribe from beyond the veil of death. Moonshadow selected a spot for Little Eagle's grave, with the same care she had shown in all her dealings with the spiritual world. The location lay between 2 ancient markers, as if the boy would rest under the protection of warriors from generations past. Despite the frozen ground, the men managed to break through the earth here, finding soil that yielded more readily to their efforts, as if the sacred nature of the place somehow softened its resistance to their tools. The burial ceremony lasted until well after sunset, with the entire tribe participating despite the continuing storm. Songs were sung that had been old when the world was young, prayers offered that carried the accumulated faith of countless generations. Little Eagle's medicine pouch was placed upon his chest, ensuring that his most precious possessions would accompany him on the journey to the spirit world. As earth fell upon the small, wrapped form, Running Bear felt something break inside his chest, a pain so sharp and sudden that he staggered and nearly fell. This was not the clean wound of battle, which could be bound and healed with time. This was the kind of injury that never fully mended, that would ache with every breath for the rest of his days. 3 days after the burial, when the storm had finally exhausted its fury and moved on to torment other lands, Running Bear returned alone to his son's grave. In his hands he carried a young cottonwood sapling that he had carefully dug from the banks of a distant stream, its roots wrapped in wet cloth to preserve its fragile life during the journey. The choice of tree was deliberate, for the cottonwood was sacred to the Apache, its rustling leaves said to carry the voices of spirits, speaking to those who knew how to listen. The ground above Little Eagle's grave had softened slightly in the warming air, making it possible for Running Bear to dig a small hole beside the burial mound. He worked with his bare hands, feeling the cold earth beneath his fingernails as he prepared a place for the sapling. Each handful of soil seemed to weigh as much as a stone, heavy with the grief that threatened to crush his spirit entirely. When the hole was ready, he placed the sapling with infinite care, arranging its delicate roots as gently as he had once tucked his son into bed. The tree seemed impossibly fragile in this harsh landscape, its few leaves already showing signs of stress from the transplanting. By all natural law, it should not survive in this barren ground, far from the water and rich soil it needed to thrive.
Little Eagle,
Running Bear whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. I plant this tree as a living memory of your spirit. Let it grow strong as you would have grown. Let it reach toward the sky as your dreams reached toward the future. In this way you will never truly be gone from us. He poured precious water around the sapling's base, water carried from the same stream where he had found the young tree. Moon's shadow appeared beside him as if summoned by his prayers, her ancient face creased with lines of understanding and compassion. In her hands she carried burning sage, its smoke rising straight up in the still air, like an offering to the spirits above. The tree will grow, she said with quiet certainty, her words carrying the weight of prophecy. It will become something beyond what we can imagine, for it is planted with a father's love and watered with a warrior's tear. The spirits will bless this place, and what grows here will serve purposes we cannot yet understand. Running Bear looked at the frail sapling with eyes blurred by unshed tears. He could not see how such a fragile thing could survive, much less thrive, in this unforgiving place. But Moon Shadow's words carried power, and he found himself believing despite all evidence to the contrary. Perhaps faith was all they had left now, faith that love could transcend death, that memory could take root and flourish even in the hardest ground. 1 year passed like a season of dreams, marked by the slow healing of a people who had lost too much, yet somehow found the strength to continue. The Apache had endured, as they always did, adapting to their losses and finding new ways to honor those who had walked the spirit trail before them. But when Running Bear returned to his son's grave on the anniversary of the planting, what he discovered there defied every natural law he had ever understood. The cottonwood sapling had grown into a tree that stood nearly twice the height of a man, its trunk thick as a warrior's torso, and its branches spread wide enough to cast shade over the entire burial site. The growth was impossible by any measure of nature's usual patterns, representing decades of development compressed into a single year. The leaves rustled in the desert wind with a sound unlike any cottonwood Running Bear had ever heard, almost like whispered voices carrying on conversations in a language just beyond human understanding. Chief Standing Wolf stood beside the transformed tree, his weathered face a mask of wonder and barely concealed fear. In his hands he held his sacred vision pipe, the ceremonial instrument he used to commune with the spirit world during times of great uncertainty. The pipe had been carved from the bone of a sacred white buffalo by his grandfather's grandfather, and its smoke was said to carry prayers directly to the ears of the ancestors. I have seen many strange things in my years, the chief said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom and the tremor of genuine awe. I have witnessed visions that spoke of futures yet to come, heard the voices of the dead calling warnings from beyond the veil. But this tree challenges everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. The Apache warriors who had accompanied them to the burial ground maintained a respectful distance from the tree, their hands resting on their weapons, more from nervousness than any real sense of threat. These were men who had faced cavalry charges and gunfire without flinching, yet the supernatural presence radiating from the cottonwood filled them with an uncertainty they rarely experienced. The tree seemed to pulse with life in ways that went far beyond normal plant growth, as if some powerful force had taken residence within its rapidly expanding form. Animals had begun gathering around the tree in unprecedented numbers, drawn by some invisible summons that transcended their natural instincts. Desert creatures that normally avoided each other shared the shade without conflict, predators and prey resting side by side as if some greater power had declared this ground neutral territory. Rabbits grazed peacefully while hawks perched in the branches above them, and even the occasional rattlesnake coiled in the dappled sunlight without striking at the small creatures that wandered near. The most unsettling phenomenon was the weather around the tree itself. While the rest of the desert baked under the relentless summer sun, the air beneath the cottonwood's branches remained cool and fresh, as if an underground spring fed moisture to roots that should have struggled to find purchase in the arid soil. Grass grew thick and green in a perfect circle around the trunk, creating an oasis of life in the middle of land that normally supported only the hardiest of desert plants. Running Bear approached the tree with steps that grew more hesitant with each yard traveled. The closer he came to the cottonwood, the more strongly he felt a presence watching him, studying him, with intelligence that seemed both alien and somehow familiar. The sensation reminded him of the way Little Eagle used to look at him when the boy was thinking deeply about some question that occupied his quick mind, head tilted slightly to one side in an expression of intense concentration. "Can you feel him?" Running Bear whispered to Moonshadow, who had joined the group despite her advanced age making the journey difficult. "Can you sense Little Eagle's spirit in this place?" The old medicine woman closed her eyes and extended her hands toward the tree, her fingers trembling slightly as they encountered currents of spiritual energy invisible to normal sight. When she opened her eyes again, they held a mixture of wonder and deep concern that sent chills through the watching warriors. "The boundary between worlds grows thin here," she said, her voice barely audible above the strange music of the leaves. "Your son's spirit has not departed as it should have. Instead, it has taken root in this tree, binding itself to our world through love and memory. But such binding comes with consequences none of us can fully understand." Word of the miraculous tree spread through the Apache camps like wildfire carried on desert winds, growing larger and more fantastic with each telling. Warriors returning from hunting expeditions reported seeing the massive cottonwood from distances that should have made such observation impossible, its distinctive silhouette rising above the landscape like a green beacon, calling to travelers across the wasteland. Women gathering plants for food and medicine claimed they could hear voices in the wind whenever they passed near the sacred burial ground, voices that spoke in the high, clear tones of children at play. The most disturbing reports came from those brave enough to spend entire nights near the tree, maintaining vigils that combined curiosity with deep spiritual purpose. They spoke of sounds that had no earthly source, of laughter echoing from empty air, of footsteps circling the trunk where no living creature could be seen moving in the darkness. Some claimed to have glimpsed a small figure darting between the branches in the moonlight, always just at the edge of vision, always vanishing when observed directly. Running Bear found himself drawn to the tree with increasing frequency, unable to stay away despite the growing unease it created in his heart. Each visit revealed new impossibilities that challenged his understanding of the natural world. The tree's growth showed no signs of slowing, adding height and girth at a rate that defied every season's normal rhythm. Its roots had spread so far and deep that they had somehow located an underground water source, creating the oasis effect that sustained the impossible patch of green grass and wildflowers surrounding the burial site. On his most recent visit, Running Bear had discovered something that sent him fleeing the sacred ground in terror and wonder combined. There, nestled among the exposed roots at the tree's base, lay a small arrowhead that he recognized with absolute certainty. It was the same perfectly crafted point that Little Eagle had treasured above all his possessions, the one the boy had carried everywhere in his medicine pouch, the one that had been buried with him according to Apache custom. The arrowhead was exactly as Running Bear remembered it, unchanged by time or earth, its surface polished to the same mirror brightness that had caught the light when Little Eagle held it up for his father's admiration. But it should not exist in the world of the living, should rest with the boy's remains beneath 6 feet of sacred earth. Its presence above ground suggested possibilities that terrified the rational mind, while simultaneously filling the grieving heart with desperate hope. Moon Shadow examined the arrowhead with hands that shook from more than her advanced age, turning the stone artifact over and over as if its smooth surface might reveal secrets hidden from normal sight. Her weathered features grew increasingly troubled as she conducted her investigation, muttering prayers and incantations in the oldest form of Apache speech, words so ancient that few among the living could understand their full meaning. "This should not be," she finally pronounced, setting the arrowhead carefully on a flat stone beside the tree's massive trunk. "The dead do not return their possessions to the living without purpose. Your son's spirit grows stronger, more connected to our world with each passing season. Soon the boundary between life and death may weaken so much that he can cross back entirely." The possibility filled Running Bear with emotions too complex to untangle. Part of him yearned for such a reunion with desperate intensity, dreaming of once again holding his son in his arms, of hearing Little Eagle's laughter ring across the desert air. But another part of him, the part trained in Apache's spiritual wisdom, understood that such crossings came with prices too terrible to imagine. The dead belonged in the spirit world for reasons that transcended human desire, and attempts to call them back often brought consequences that destroyed both the living and the dead. Other members of the tribe began to divide into 2 distinct camps regarding the miraculous tree and its growing influence. Some viewed it as a sacred blessing, proof that the spirits looked favorably upon their people and offered comfort in times of loss. These believers made pilgrimages to the burial ground, bringing offerings of food and precious objects to leave beneath the cottonwood's spreading branches, hoping to earn the favor of whatever power resided within its supernatural growth. The opposing faction, led by several of the tribe's more conservative elders, viewed the tree with deep suspicion and growing alarm. They argued that tampering with the natural order of death and rebirth violated fundamental Apache spiritual principles, and that the tree's continued growth represented a dangerous corruption of sacred burial ground. These skeptics whispered among themselves about the need to cut down the cottonwood before its influence spread further, though none dared voice such thoughts openly, while Running Bear remained in the camp. The debate might have continued indefinitely, with both sides marshalling arguments from Apache tradition and spiritual wisdom, but external forces soon rendered such discussions meaningless. On a crisp morning in late autumn, as the first frost painted the desert plants with crystal decorations, a column of blue uniformed soldiers appeared on the ridge overlooking the Apache settlement. Their brass buttons caught the early sunlight like fallen stars, and their horses' hooves rang against stone with the sound of approaching doom. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Mackenzie rode at the head of the column, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination that spoke of a man carrying out orders he found distasteful, but necessary. In his saddlebags, he carried official papers bearing the seal of the territorial government, documents that would forever change the lives of every Apache man, woman, and child in the valley below. The treaty papers represented years of political maneuvering in Washington, negotiations conducted by men who had never seen the land they were redistributing, who understood nothing of the spiritual connections that bound the Apache to their ancestral territory. Chief Standing Wolf emerged from his wickiup, with the measured dignity that had served him well through decades of dealing with white officials. He wore his finest ceremonial clothing, the buckskin shirt, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of his greatest victories, the eagle feathers in his hair marking achievements in both war and peace. Despite the circumstances, he maintained the bearing of a leader addressing equals, though both men understood the reality of their respective positions. "Chief Standing Wolf," Mackenzie said, dismounting from his horse and approaching with the studied courtesy of a professional soldier. "I carry orders from the territorial governor requiring the immediate relocation of your people to the San Carlos reservation. You have 30 days to gather your possessions and prepare for the journey." The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and despair throughout the listening crowd. The San Carlos reservation lay hundreds of miles to the southeast, a barren stretch of desert and scrubland, where other Apache bands had been confined like prisoners, their traditional ways of life systematically dismantled by government agents who viewed assimilation as the only path to peaceful coexistence. Running Bear felt the treaty papers' impact like a physical blow to his chest. Leaving this valley meant abandoning Little Eagle's grave, meant severing the spiritual connection that bound his son's spirit to the miraculous tree. The thought of the cottonwood standing alone in the abandoned burial ground, its supernatural growth continuing without Apache witnesses to marvel at its impossible development, filled him with a despair that threatened to overwhelm his warrior's composure. "Our ancestors are buried in this ground," Standing Wolf replied, his voice carrying across the silent camp with the authority of absolute conviction. "For generations beyond counting, Apache feet have walked these paths, Apache hands have drawn water from these springs, Apache hearts have found peace in these sacred places. You ask us to tear ourselves from the very roots of our existence." Mackenzie's expression softened slightly, revealing the man behind the uniform, someone who had spent enough time on the frontier to understand what such displacement meant to indigenous peoples. But sympathy could not overcome duty, and his orders left no room for negotiation or compromise. "I understand the difficulty of this situation," he said carefully, "but these orders come from the highest levels of government. Failure to comply will result in military action that neither of us wants to see." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood by everyone present. The Apache had seen what happened to tribes that resisted relocation too forcefully, had heard stories of villages burned and families scattered across the territory like leaves blown by winter storms. Standing Wolf possessed the wisdom to recognize when resistance would serve no purpose except to bring greater suffering upon his people. Life on the San Carlos reservation proved even harsher than the Apache had feared during their forced march across hundreds of miles of unforgiving desert. The government agent, a thin man named Cornelius Whitman, whose pale eyes held the fervor of someone convinced that civilization could be imposed through regulation and punishment, distributed their meager rations with the precision of a man counting coins. Each family received identical portions regardless of size or need. Measured portions of flour, beans, and occasionally rancid meat that bore no resemblance to the varied diet their people had enjoyed when free to hunt and gather across their traditional territory. The ration tickets themselves became symbols of their reduced circumstances, small pieces of cardboard that represented the difference between eating and going hungry. Running Bear examined his family's weekly allotment with growing anger, understanding that these scraps of paper marked the transformation of his people from proud hunters and warriors into dependent wards of a government that viewed their very existence as a problem to be managed rather than lives to be respected. Children who had once learned Apache ways through stories and example now sat in wooden desks inside a building the agent called a schoolhouse, forbidden to speak their native language, punished for any display of traditional customs or spiritual practices. The boys' long hair, a source of strength and identity in Apache culture, was shorn short in the white man's fashion, while girls were dressed in stiff, uncomfortable clothing that restricted their movement and eliminated any trace of tribal identity from their appearance. Running Bear watched his people's spirit slowly drain away like water disappearing into desert sand, Warriors who had once moved through the landscape with the fluid grace of natural predators now shuffled between identical government buildings with the defeated posture of broken men. Women who had taken pride in their intricate beadwork and traditional crafts were forced to abandon these skills in favor of what the agent called domestic science, learning to cook and clean in the white man's fashion regardless of their own cultural knowledge and preferences. The most painful aspect of reservation life was the systematic attempt to sever all connections to Apache's spiritual practices. The agent viewed their ceremonies as primitive superstitions that prevented proper assimilation into American society. Sacred objects were confiscated and destroyed, traditional songs were banned, and anyone caught practicing Apache religion faced punishment that ranged from reduced rations to confinement in the reservation's crude jail. Yet despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, stories about the miraculous cottonwood tree continued to circulate among the displaced Apache. Warriors returning from hunting parties allowed by the reservation system brought reports that the tree continued to grow at its impossible rate, now standing tall enough to be seen from vast distances, its presence dominating the landscape around the abandoned burial ground like a green monument to Apache memory and loss. Moon Shadow, despite her advanced age and the difficult conditions of reservation life, maintained her role as keeper of tribal spiritual knowledge through careful discretion and quiet determination. She moved among the people like a ghost of their former lives, offering healing herbs gathered in secret, conducting abbreviated ceremonies in hidden locations, keeping alive the flames of Apache tradition despite the agent's best efforts to extinguish them forever. During one of these clandestine gatherings, held in the darkness behind the women's dormitory while the agent slept in his comfortable house on the other side of the compound, Moon Shadow shared a vision that had come to her during meditation. She spoke of the cottonwood tree calling to its displaced people, of Little Eagle's spirit growing stronger with each passing season, of a future when the Apache would return to their sacred ground to discover truths that would transform their understanding of life and death. "The tree remembers us," she whispered to the circle of listeners who risked punishment to hear her words. "It grows not just in size, but in power, preparing for a time when our people will have great need of the strength it offers. Your son's spirit has not abandoned us, Running Bear. It waits with patience beyond human understanding for the moment when we can return to receive the gifts it has prepared." Running Bear clung to these words like a drowning man grasping driftwood in a stormy sea. The daily humiliations of reservation life, the systematic destruction of everything his people held sacred, the slow death of Apache culture under the relentless pressure of enforced assimilation, all these burdens became slightly more bearable when he remembered the impossible tree standing guard over his son's grave. 10 years passed with the grinding slowness of seasons unmarked by traditional ceremonies or celebrations, 10 years of watching his people adapt to circumstances no human beings should be forced to endure. But adaptation, Running Bear had learned, was different from surrender, and beneath the surface compliance required for survival, the Apache spirit remained unbroken. The stories that filtered back to the reservation about the cottonwood tree grew more fantastic, with each telling, until Running Bear began to wonder if grief and longing had transformed memory into myth. Travelers spoke of a tree so massive that its shadow could shelter an entire village, of branches that moved without wind, of a presence so powerful that even hardened cavalry soldiers refused to make camp within sight of its impossible silhouette. Some claimed the tree had begun to glow with an inner light during certain phases of the moon, while others swore they had seen figures moving among its branches, spirits of the Apache dead, maintaining eternal watch over their sacred burial ground. The most compelling testimony came from a young Apache scout named Grey Wolf, who worked for the Territorial Army tracking hostile bands that still roamed free in the mountains. His duties had brought him near the old burial ground during a pursuit that lasted several days, and what he witnessed there had shaken him so profoundly that he risked punishment by abandoning his military responsibilities to bring word to the reservation. "The tree has become something beyond nature," he told the gathered elders during another secret meeting held far from the agent's watchful eyes. It stands 3 times the height of any cottonwood I have ever seen, its trunk so massive that 20 linking hands could not encircle it. But size is not the strangest thing about it. Grey Wolf paused in his account, his young face troubled by memories that challenged his understanding of the world. When he continued, his voice carried the tremor of someone who had witnessed miracles that logic could not explain. The air around the tree feels different, charged with power, like the moments before a great thunderstorm. Animals gather there in numbers that defy explanation, not just desert creatures, but elk and deer from the mountains, birds that should not exist in such arid country. They show no fear of each other, no concern for natural boundaries between predator and prey. Running Bear leaned forward, his heart racing with anticipation and barely contained hope. "Did you see anything else? Any other sign?" The scout's eyes met his directly, and in them Running Bear saw recognition of shared loss and impossible longing. "I saw a child playing among the branches," Grey Wolf whispered. "A boy with copper-colored hair who moved like wind through the leaves, laughing with joy that carried farther than any human voice should reach. When he noticed my presence, he waved as if greeting an old friend, then vanished like smoke dispersing in the breeze." The description struck Running Bear like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. Little Eagle had possessed exactly that shade of hair, inherited from his grandmother's bloodline, and his laughter had always carried farther than seemed possible for such a small chest. The possibility that his son's spirit not only survived but thrived in connection with the miraculous tree filled him with emotions too complex to untangle. Moon Shadow reached into her carefully hidden medicine bundle and withdrew a single cottonwood leaf, dried and pressed between pieces of cloth to preserve its shape and color. The leaf was enormous, larger than any Running Bear had ever seen, with an unusual golden tinge that seemed to hold light even in the dim interior of their secret meeting place. "This came to me through traders who passed near the burial ground," she explained, handling the leaf with reverence typically reserved for the most sacred objects. "They found it floating in a stream 20 miles from the tree, carried by water that should not have existed in that dry country. The leaf shows no signs of decay despite being separated from its source for many moons." Running Bear reached out to touch the leaf with fingers that trembled slightly. The moment his skin made contact with its surface, he felt a jolt of recognition so powerful that he nearly dropped the precious artifact. The sensation was identical to the feeling he had experienced when holding Little Eagle's small hand, a warmth that seemed to flow directly from spirit to spirit without passing through the physical world at all. "We must return," he said, the words emerging from some deep place beyond rational thought. "Whatever the risks, whatever the consequences, we cannot leave our sacred places unguarded forever. The tree calls to us, and we have an obligation to answer that call." Chief Standing Wolf, now bearing the weight of many additional years and the accumulated sorrows of reservation life, nodded slowly. His weathered face showed the lines of a man who had made too many impossible decisions, who had guided his people through losses that would have broken lesser leaders. But beneath the fatigue and sorrow, Running Bear could see the spark of the warrior chief who had once led raids against superior numbers and emerged victorious through cunning and courage. "The time approaches for such a journey," Standing Wolf agreed. "Too many of our people have died in this place of slow death. Too many of our children have forgotten the songs their grandmothers sang. If we are to survive as Apache rather than shadows of our former selves, we must reconnect with the sources of our power." Planning the return journey required patience and careful coordination that tested every skill the Apache had developed for surviving under the watchful eyes of their captors. The reservation system was designed to prevent exactly this kind of organized movement, with regular head counts and strict controls on travel beyond the compound boundaries. But the same survival instincts that had allowed the Apache to evade cavalry patrols for generations now served them in evading the bureaucratic controls that sought to contain their spirits as thoroughly as fences contained their bodies. Running Bear spent months preparing for the dangerous expedition, carefully gathering supplies that could be obtained without arousing suspicion. Each item in his travel bundle carried multiple purposes and deep significance, from the dried meat that would sustain their bodies during the journey to the sacred objects that would protect their spirits from the hostile forces they would inevitably encounter. His war lance, carefully hidden since their arrival at the reservation, emerged from its concealment like an old friend returning from a long absence. The bundle itself became a symbol of Apache determination to reconnect with their heritage, despite all obstacles placed in their path. Inside its carefully sewn leather wrapping lay everything necessary for survival in the harsh desert, as well as items that spoke to deeper needs of the human spirit. Sage for purification ceremonies, small pouches of sacred pollen, and strips of cloth that could be tied to tree branches as prayer offerings. All these represented the spiritual preparation necessary for approaching ground made sacred by generations of Apache reverence. Moon Shadow, despite her advanced age and the physical limitations that made travel increasingly difficult, insisted on joining the expedition. Her presence would be essential for interpreting whatever supernatural phenomena they might encounter at the burial ground, and her knowledge of Apache spiritual traditions provided the only reliable guide for dealing with forces that existed beyond normal human experience. "I have seen too many seasons to fear death," she told Running Bear when he expressed concern about the risks such a journey posed to someone of her years, "but I fear dying without witnessing what your son's spirit has accomplished in our absence. The tree calls to me in dreams with voices I recognize from childhood, spirits of medicine women who walked the path before me. They whisper of great purposes unfolding, of powers gathering that will reshape our people's destiny." The final member of their small expedition was Grey Wolf, whose military experience and knowledge of current territorial patrols made him invaluable for avoiding the army units that might attempt to force their return to the reservation. His presence also provided a connection between the traditional Apache ways and the harsh realities of survival in a world increasingly dominated by white settlement and military control. Under the cover of a moonless night when darkness provided maximum concealment, the three Apaches slipped away from the reservation like shadows detaching themselves from deeper darkness. They moved with the fluid silence that had once made their people feared warriors, each step planned and executed with the precision of hunters who understood that discovery meant death or worse. The journey ahead would take them across hundreds of miles of territory, now claimed by ranchers and patrolled by soldiers, through lands where Apache presence was viewed as an automatic threat, requiring immediate military response. But beneath the immediate dangers of discovery and capture lay deeper uncertainties about what they would find at their destination, what changes 10 years of abandonment might have wrought upon ground that had been sacred long before Little Eagle's spirit had chosen to inhabit the growing cottonwood tree. As they moved through the desert darkness, Running Bear felt the weight of his travel bundle against his shoulders like the physical manifestation of hope and determination combined. Each item within that carefully prepared collection represented a thread, connecting him to the life his people had lived before the reservation, to the spiritual practices that gave meaning to existence beyond mere survival. The stars above provided navigation and companionship, their familiar patterns unchanged by the political upheavals that had transformed the world below. Running Bear remembered teaching Little Eagle to read those same stellar maps, showing the boy how Apache ancestors had used celestial guides to find their way across vast distances. Now those same stars would guide him back to his son's resting place, where a miracle grew in defiance of every natural law, where the boundary between life and death had become as permeable as morning mist. Behind them, the reservation slept in ignorance of their departure, its residents unaware that 3 of their number had chosen freedom over security, had traded the certainty of slow death for the possibility of spiritual renewal. Ahead lay uncertainty measured in days of dangerous travel and nights spent hiding from patrols, but also the promise of answers to questions that had haunted Running Bear's dreams for a decade. The first sight of the transformed burial ground struck the 3 Apache travelers with the force of divine revelation. What had once been a modest collection of weathered stones marking ancient graves now existed in the shadow of something that challenged every assumption about the natural world. The cottonwood tree had grown beyond all possibility of normal development, its massive trunk rising from the desert floor like a pillar supporting the sky itself, its canopy spreading so wide that it created a zone of perpetual twilight across acres of previously barren ground. The tree's shadow fell across the landscape with supernatural precision, creating a perfect circle of coolness and life in the middle of terrain that should have supported only the hardiest desert plants. Within that magical boundary, grass grew thick and green, wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and small streams appeared to flow from springs that had no earthly source. The entire area pulsed with life in ways that defied explanation, as if the tree had become a generator of vitality that transformed everything within reach of its influence. Running Bear approached the transformed burial ground with steps that grew more hesitant as the supernatural presence grew stronger. The air itself seemed different here, charged with energy that made his skin tingle and his hair stand on end. Every breath carried scents that belonged to distant forests rather than arid desert, pine and wildflower fragrances that spoke of environments hundreds of miles away from this harsh landscape. Grey Wolf remained at the edge of the miraculous zone, his military training warring with spiritual instincts that recognized forces beyond normal human experience. The young scout's weathered features showed the strain of trying to reconcile what his eyes witnessed with everything he thought he knew about the world's fundamental laws. "This is not natural," he whispered, his voice carrying the tremor of someone whose basic assumptions about reality had just been shattered. "Trees do not grow this large in a single decade. Deserts do not bloom with mountain flowers. Water does not flow where no rain has fallen for seasons without number." Moon Shadow moved forward with the fearless determination of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with mysteries that existed beyond normal perception. Her ancient hands extended toward the tree as if she could feel currents of power flowing from its massive trunk, invisible forces that spoke to spiritual senses developed through decades of shamanic practice. "Natural has no meaning in this place," she replied, her voice filled with awe and barely contained excitement. "We stand at the intersection of worlds, where the realm of spirits touches the land of the living. Your son has become something unprecedented, Running Bear. His spirit has not merely survived death, but has grown in power and purpose beyond anything our traditions describe." The massive tree's shadow seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting in patterns that matched no earthly cycle. Within that shifting darkness, movement could be glimpsed, just at the edge of vision, fleeting shapes that appeared and vanished too quickly for detailed observation. The overall effect created an atmosphere of anticipation, as if the entire transformed landscape waited for some climactic event to unfold. Animals moved through the magical zone with behavior that completely violated their natural instincts and territorial patterns. Deer grazed peacefully beside mountain lions. Rabbits hopped fearlessly past coiled rattlesnakes, and birds of prey perched alongside their usual victims, without any display of hunger or aggression. The supernatural peace that governed this place extended to creatures that would normally view each other as mortal enemies, creating a harmony that spoke to powers operating beyond biological imperatives. As Running Bear drew closer to the tree's base, he began to notice artifacts that should not have existed in the physical world. Scattered among the exposed roots lay objects he recognized from Little Eagle's childhood, toys and tools that had been buried with the boy according to Apache custom, but now rested in the open air as if they had grown from the earth itself. Each item appeared exactly as he remembered it, unmarked by time or decay, preserved by forces that transcended normal decomposition. The wooden toy horse that Little Eagle had carved with his own small hands lay beside a collection of arrowheads the boy had crafted during long winter evenings, learning the ancient skills that connected him to generations of Apache hunters and warriors. Near these familiar objects, other artifacts had appeared, that belonged to no earthly source, crystalline formations that seemed to pulse with inner light, carved stones bearing symbols that predated any human language, objects that suggested Little Eagle's spirit had gained access to knowledge and power from sources beyond the physical world. Moon Shadow knelt beside these impossible artifacts, with hands that trembled from more than her advanced age. Her lifetime of spiritual practice had prepared her for mysteries that existed beyond normal experience, but what she witnessed here challenged even her extensive knowledge of the supernatural realm. "The boundaries have not merely weakened," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of prophetic certainty. "They have been deliberately breached by a spirit whose love and purpose exceed anything our traditions describe. Your son has become a bridge between worlds, a conduit through which powers from the realm of the ancestors can flow into our reality." The wind that moved through the cottonwood's enormous canopy carried sounds that belonged to no earthly source, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech, melodies that seemed to emerge from the very fabric of existence itself. But beneath these cosmic harmonies, Running Bear began to distinguish something etchingly familiar, a voice he had not heard for 10 years, but would recognize across any distance, through any transformation. Little Eagle's laughter drifted down from the high branches like sunlight filtering through leaves, bright and joyful and impossibly present. The sound carried the same distinctive quality that had marked the boy's mirth in life, a musical quality that seemed to contain more happiness than any single throat should be able to produce. But now that laughter held additional elements, harmonics that suggested growth and development beyond anything possible in the physical world, Running Bear tilted his head back to peer up into the tree's vast canopy, searching for the source of that beloved sound. High among the branches, barely visible through the dense foliage, he caught glimpses of movement that might have been wind-stirred leaves, or might have been something far more significant. The movements followed patterns too purposeful for random air currents, too coordinated for coincidence. "Little Eagle," he called softly, his voice carrying all the love and longing accumulated over a decade of separation. "Can you hear me, my son?" The laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, with movements that defied gravity and natural law, a small figure began to descend through the branches with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate three-dimensional space without regard for earthly limitations. The child who emerged from the tree's concealment was recognizably Little Eagle, yet transformed in ways that spoke of spiritual growth and supernatural development. He appeared to be the same 7 years old as at the time of his death, but his eyes held depths of wisdom and experience that belonged to someone who had spent decades learning secrets hidden from mortal understanding. His physical form seemed to shift between solid presence and translucent spirit, sometimes appearing as real as any living child, sometimes becoming transparent enough that the tree trunk behind him showed through his small body. "Father," Little Eagle said, his voice carrying the same musical quality as his laughter, but now enhanced with harmonics that seemed to emerge from the tree itself, as if the massive cottonwood had become a resonating chamber for spiritual communication. "I have been waiting for you to return. There are things you must understand, choices you must make, that will determine the fate of our people." Running Bear felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he looked upon his son's transformed spirit. The grief that had defined his existence for 10 years suddenly seemed as insubstantial as morning mist compared to the overwhelming joy of this impossible reunion. Yet beneath his happiness lay growing awareness that this encounter carried implications far beyond personal consolation. "How is this possible?" he whispered, extending his hand toward Little Eagle's partially solid form. "The dead do not return to the world of the living." Little Eagle's expression grew solemn beyond his apparent years, reflecting knowledge gained through experience in realms where different laws governed existence and possibility. "I never truly left, Father. My love for you and for our people bound me to this place, preventing my spirit from joining the ancestors as it should have done." Instead, I have grown in power and understanding, learning secrets that span the gap between life and death. The boy gestured toward the massive tree that had become his spiritual home, and Running Bear noticed for the first time that the bark itself seemed to pulse with patterns of light that matched the rhythm of a vast heartbeat. The entire cottonwood had become something unprecedented in Apache tradition, a living bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, sustained by love that refused to accept the finality of death. The tree is more than my dwelling place, Little Eagle continued, his child's voice carrying the weight of cosmic understanding. It has become a doorway through which the ancestors can observe and influence events in your world. Through its roots, I can feel the suffering of our people on the reservation, the slow death of Apache culture under the weight of foreign domination. Through its branches, I can see possible futures, paths that lead either to renewal or to complete extinction. Moonshadow approached the spectral child with the reverence typically reserved for the most sacred ceremonies, her ancient features glowing with wonder at witnessing something that exceeded even her extensive spiritual knowledge. "What do the ancestors count?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the supernatural music that continued to emerge from the tree's canopy. Little Eagle turned his luminous gaze toward the elderly medicine woman, and Running Bear saw recognition pass between them, an acknowledgment of shared purpose that transcended the normal boundaries between generations and states of existence.